Hello, I'm Robert Pinsky. I'm here to welcome you to the Robert Lowell Memorial Lecture, and I'm going to very briefly explain to you what is happening here tonight. It will include, I believe, a speaker out in the foyer, so if there are people who can't fit in the room, there will be amplified sound out there. The Robert Lowell Memorial Lecture exists through the generosity of Fred Levin and Nancy Livingston through the Shenson Foundation. The full title is The Robert Lowell Memorial Lectures in the Spirit of Room 222. Room 222 here at BU at 236 Bay State Road is the room in which Robert Lowell taught a class, a poetry writing class, in which the students included George Starbuck, Anne Sexton, and Sylvia Plath. An interesting and inspiring aspect of that class is that, of course, those people did not care who was the teacher and who was the student. They didn't care about academic rank. They didn't care if you were a part professor or an associate professor or a full professor, or, above full is the engorged professor. They didn't care about titles, literary prizes, awards. They were interested in the art of poetry. In that sense, they were peers and competitors seeking the same thing, which is to know as much as possible about the art and to practice the art as well as possible. Therefore, in that spirit, this series presents a recent graduate of BU's remarkable writing program, in which Ha Jin and Leslie Epstein and Allegra Goodman and Louise Glick and I still teach writing classes in that same, not that impressive room. We begin with a recent student or graduate who reads a little bit and introduces someone who has taught in the BU writing program, and then we have the main feature, which is our invited guest. The invited guest tonight, as I suspect many of you know, is Seamus Heaney. He will be preceded by David Ferry, who has done wonderful work teaching here, one of the poets I admire the most. And the evening will begin with young Peter Campion, whose first book, Other People, published by the University of Chicago Press, is an astounding, wonderful first book. The title, Other People, catches the way in which Peter, though he is already well known to be a brilliant writer about poetry, also has a generosity of spirit, and there will be a second book appearing soon. That is my final sentence. Here is Admirable Peter Campion.
Thanks, Robert. I'm particularly gratified to still be called young by Robert. The weave is working. It's really a great honor to be reading with two poets I revere in a series named after a poet I revere. It's hard to address that, so I won't. Except to say that the poets and teachers at BU and around Boston, many of whom are here tonight, seem to me to have adopted the Bill Russell school of player-coach technique, and those of us who've been through that school remain grateful. One thing I've learned from Seamus Heaney and from David Ferry is how to write a political poem in the broadest sense, or I hope I've learned that, without temporizing. I'm just going to read two poems, and I hope that in some small way they do that. This first poem is called Just Now. Just now, a ladybug, its carapace blown open, so a translucent trace of orange gleams from its body, has ascended link by link, the smudgy silver curve of my watch band. It must have helicoptered past the sill while I was slumped here, squinting in the paper at the ashen packaging another bombing's made of a minivan. Made available in the photo like the homeless in a poem. The pain is far away, but then, for moments, utterly clear, molten metal guttering down from the Milky Way to fall on us. And sometimes, God, it lands with all its will. My spluttered prayer for it to hold its distance. How ludicrous to blurt it from this comfort. Still, it impels itself from me. Please stay away from me. Please stay away from this insectile soul that only weeks ago was wind and shit and jasmine leaves and rain. One problem of writing political poems is you're always too late. And it's October 2nd, and the second poem here I'll read is called September. September. How clean the thousand surfaces, rivers, RVs, and orange mesas emerge each morning. Rows of privet, clipped and swept. A linen blouse uncreased beneath the steaming iron. Again and again, the world is rinsed to a scintillant mesh, and still the faces gush from arrival gates, throbbing with this bare imperative to populate the shivering expanse, this drive of the body itself to slice a space out of the aggregate and hold it at whatever cost of blood, semen, money, spit. It's a great pleasure to introduce David Ferry. David Ferry is Sophie Chantal Hart Professor Emeritus of English at Wellesley College and a visiting lecturer in creative writing here at Boston University. He's published 4 collections of original poems and 5 of poetry and translation, as well as a study of Wordsworth. He's earned such honors as the Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize, the Rebecca Johnson Bobbitt National Prize, an Academy of American Poets Fellowship, you see the list goes on, the Harold Morton Landon Translation Award, the Teasdale Prize for Poetry, a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, an Ingram Merrill Award, and the William Arrowsmith Translation Prize, which is the best of them, from Agni Magazine here at BU. But this is only to begin to explain David Ferry's achievement. In fact, it seems bizarre to describe his work by festooning it with accolades. Don't get me wrong, he certainly deserves those prizes. But Ferry remains our great poet of the unadorned, of bare life. His poems reflect and give form to the natural nobility of sheer being. I think of his lyric, Sculptures by Dmitri Hadzi. This is a sculptor to whom Seamus Heaney, a great sculptor who lived in this area for many years, to whom Seamus Heaney has also dedicated a poem. The poem begins with an image of Hadzi's sculptures standing outdoors in Rome, then alludes to the civilians massacred by the Germans in Rome in 1944. Here's how Ferry conjures the sculptures themselves in lines that entwine the work of art and the work of justice. Their flowering is their being true to their own nature, not being a glory, a victory, being a record, the way things are in war. In the nature of things, the flowers grow with the authority of telling the truth. Their brightness is dark with it. I don't think David Ferry has a sententious bone in his body, and yet his poems always stand with that authority of telling the truth. You can hear it in the stark rhythms, in those plain yet oracular register, in the plain yet oracular register of those statements. And against this directness, this classical poise, Ferry also runs an interference pattern, a current of salutary oddness. Even while writing of familiar objects and scenes, he returns us to some original, tonic strangeness, proving, as Wallace Stevens once put it, the eccentric to be the base of design. Sometimes this shows in lines and sentences that curve back on themselves with the ludic verve of a Paul Klee. At other moments, it appears as chilling X-ray vision, as when, at the end of one poem, the faces in a family photograph taken in Virginia in 1911 suddenly turn Russian, foreign, of no country I know. Ferry's fusion of directness and mystery conveys an ethical force. I mean that the people in his poems carry intense singularities. Human connection in these poems becomes tenuous, crucial, never to be taken for granted. So too, this poet's language is both exact and exacting, plucked from the pulse and nerve of his line, a line as fine-tuned as the musicians or the tightrope walkers. His individual words ring with the sound of necessity, the necessity of making those forms in which we dwell, whether they be a marriage, an afternoon in a garden, or an entire civilization. I can't think of another living poet who writes more beautifully out of the bare risk and vitality of such form-finding than the poet to whom it's my great honor and pleasure to give way now, David Ferry.
It's a pleasure to be caught between two writers I admire so much. One of them early in what is already becoming a distinguished career. The other, maybe and rightly, the most celebrated living writer of verse in English. I'm just going to read two poems of my own, one of them a translation. I'm reading the translation because it's from Anglo-Saxon, a very great Anglo-Saxon poem dating from sometime before 1000 AD, maybe a long time before. Very different from the great poem, The Beowulf, that Seamus has so famously translated. I want, in praise of him, to associate myself with the enterprise of translating from that language our language both descends from, even though the poems are so different in kind. The poem I want to read is the disturbing, hair-raising, generous account of the Aeneid, the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Isaac. Then the Lord wanted to know how steadfast was his man. So he said in the Lord's stern voice, Abraham, Abraham, you must take your beloved child, your only son, and go with him to where I will show you where to go. A place there is, high in the hills. You must climb up there on foot, the two of you together. Around you only nothing. Only the mountain peaks around you, witnessing. And there, make ready a fire, a bale fire for your bairn. And then you must, yourself, take up the sword you carry and kill him with its edge and burn his dear body black in the flames you have set going, and present what you have done, a burnt offering to me. Abraham heard the Lord and did not put off the journey. At once he made his way, determined and intent on the task that he had been commanded to undertake. He was in awe of the word of the Lord God of angels. He was the Lord's servant, eager to please his master. Blessed was Abraham. Without any night rest, he got up from his bed. He obeyed without any question the commandment of the Lord. He girded on his sword, fear of the Lord's word, continual in his breast. That good old man, the giver of rings to his followers. He harnessed and bridled his asses and selected from his household 2 young men and told them to go with him on his journey. Isaac, his half-grown son, was the 3rd one of the party. He was himself the 4th. So together they went to do the bidding of the Lord, hastening on their way across the deserted landscape, until on the 3rd day, the bright light of the morning rose up from the deep water, where everything begins. There then, the blessed man looked up and saw the high mountain that the Lord had told him they were to go to. Abraham spoke to the 2 retainers and said, "My men, stay here where we have camped. We will return when we have carried out what the King of Souls has told us to do." Then Abraham left them and went up onto the high mountain, climbing through woods and groves, taking his own son with him. The son carried the wood, the father carried the fire, and was carrying the sword. Then his beloved son, trudging beside his father, said to his father, "Father, we're carrying the wood, the fire, and the sword to do what the bright Lord asked us to do. But where is the sacrificial victim? Where is the offering to put upon the fire?" His father, who was steadfast, faithful to what the Creator had told him to do, replied, "He who is the true king, the guardian, protector of his people, he will find what is right and what is fitting for this." Then, obedient, resolute, steadfast, he went on climbing up the steep mountain with his only son beside him until they came to the top, to the place to which the Lord had told him where to go. And there he took the sticks of wood his son had carried, and with them made ready the fire. Only the mountains around, witnessing what they were doing, what he was doing. Hand and foot he bound his only son, young half-grown Isaac, and lifted his own child up and laid him on the pyre, and took up the sword in his hand and stood there ready to kill him, and for the thirsty fire to drink the blood of his boy. Then suddenly from above, an angel of the Lord called out to Abraham in a loud voice, "Abraham!" Abraham stood still he stood stock still and listened and heard the words of the angel. Abraham, do not kill your only son. Take him up, lift him away from the pyre you have put him upon. The Lord has granted him great honor, and you, great scion and patriarch of the Hebrews, will be given many rewards by the guardian of souls, because you were willing to sacrifice your son, your beloved only son, in obedience to the Lord and for the love of him. The fire went on burning. The Creator of mankind had so approved the heart of Abraham, Lot's kinsman, that he gave him back his bairn in safety and alive. Then Abraham, the brother of Haran, turned his head and looked back over his shoulder and saw, not far away, a ram caught in the brambles. Then he took hold of the ram and quickly lifted it up onto the burning pyre and took his sword and killed it in place of his own son. There on the smoking altar, stained with the blood of the ram, he offered to the Lord the burnt offering in gratitude for the gifts he had given them and would give forever and ever after. It's pointless to introduce Seamus Heaney with a list of those honors, for example, the Nobel Prize that celebrate him. Everybody knows them, and everybody who reads poetry is proud of him for them. I'd rather, in just a few sentences, say some few things about what it's like for me to read Heaney's poems. To do this, I want to read another poem of mine, a short one, that tries to say some things about poems and the ways life occurs within them in the act of writing them. My poem is titled Of Rhyme, but rhyme is only an example. The poem is about how poems, the ones that are fully alive, find out what they are, line after line, their forms shaping themselves into identity. Of Rhyme. The task is the discovering of a rhyme whose consequence is just, though unforeknown, either in its completion having been prepared for, though in secret, all the time, or in the way each step of the way brings in to play with one another in the game, considerations hitherto unknown, new differences, discovering the same. The discovering is an ordering in time, such that one seems to chance upon one's own birth name, engraved upon a stone, in consequence of the completion of the rhyme. Seamus's poems are alive from the get-go. Every one of them is, in just this way. They're like sentient beings finding out who they are. Each new line develops from its own newly discovered, almost surprised, and newly delighted understanding of the line before, and newly delighted finding out, by becoming so, what it's going to be. And then almost as if it has a secret to pass on, passes it on to the line that comes after it, which will then come to its own delighted understanding, though as yet uncompleted understanding of what has gone on before it, and passes its secret along. And so the poem develops, fully alive, shaping its forms, finding out what they are, and comes finally to a fully delighted celebration and completed understanding of what it means and how it has gotten there. Nothing is superimposed. Nothing is fully known about beforehand. Even when the poem reveals that it is, after all, a sonnet or written in quatrains, it's as if, so fully alive in the language of them, the poem had found out that this was going to be so, as if inventing these forms for the first time. And so each poem ends up with its own discovery of its birth name, like finding out who you are, at least in that poem, as it found out what it is. Fully alive, coming to life, each beautiful step of the way, nothing inert, discovering in an ordering in time, considerations hitherto unknown, new differences discovering the same, playing with one another in the game, seeming to chance upon one's own birth name in the completed poem, finally coming to rest. Its artifice, though not at all artificial, it is artifice understood as an activity, a form of life. I'm kind of proud of something I said in my introduction to my translation of Virgil's eclogues. Eclogues interest me, and they interest Seamus wonderfully in his case. But what I said is, I think, true of all poems. I wasn't thinking of him when I wrote it, but I might well have been. The eclogues are a radical instance of what is true of all poetry. Our vivid consciousness of the artifice of its forms makes us vividly, radiantly conscious of our experience of its meanings. Seamus Heaney's poems are radiant, sentient beings, and they make us so when we experience them. It's a privilege to tell him what he already knows, how welcome he is here, and how excited we are to hear him.
Well, it's honorific, invigorating, and elevating to be here in this company for this particular lecture in this university, sponsored by this department in memory of a great translator and a great poet and a great dangerous talent, Robert Lowell. There's no way of responding adequately to the generous introduction. I have to say, I think it was very, very good, and very beautiful. And I'll try to make it true, David, for the rest of my days. I want to begin because we are in a school of poetry with a poem about a school of poetry closing in memory of Robert Lowell and in gratitude for the great teachers and poets who have been associated with the university here and with this school of writing. It's a 14th century bardic poem from the Irish language. It's in memory, a poem by Taig O'Higgin, in memory of his brother Fergal, who kept a school of poetry. These schools of poetry, bardic schools, were already in the 15th century. I suppose they'd been running for 600 or 700 years. There's a description of them. The pupils came to a school where they spent from early fall to late spring, it would seem, from the inner evidence in this poem anyway. They learnt off by heart the corpus of writing in the Irish language poetic tradition, genealogies, religious poetry, metrical forms, and so on. They were given exercises, and the exercises were to be completed mentally. They composed these poems at night in the dark on their beds, and then they presented them orally to the teacher. So this is a lament for a teacher by a brother poet. And it's not the whole poem. The whole poem goes on along. These bardic guys really went on and on. This is adequately long, but it's much shorter than Taig would have liked it to be, I think. A school of poetry closes. Tonight the schools break up. The beds will be deserted, and we who occupied them will weep and separate. Too bad so many of us who bedded down last night here in our usual places won't close an eye tonight. My God, how will I bear it? My home from home abandoned, and all its past fame cancelled. What is the sense of it? Towards Samhain, that's the Halloween time, towards Samhain, the poetry class would reassemble always. If one man were still with us, this breakup would not happen. Whoever came here to him for lodging and art training would come to hate it once the cuckoo started calling. For then the school broke up and students headed homeward. But now they won't be back here for art or training ever. I would think long when that break came. I missed my class and master, but thinking long won't soothe me for the death of Fergal Rua. Since no one can replace him, it is better to disperse now. Another teacher's lessons would be like going to prison. For 30 years and over, let me be the first to say it, his esteem kept me alive. Now grief has dug my grave. My God, how will I bear it? I have drunk a bitter glassful, and God, it is all the sorer in the aftermath of pleasure. Without fail, every night I was close to him and working. I shared the hut with O'Higgin until I was fully fledged. And if anyone bad-mouthed me behind backs to my tutor, he never deigned to notice. I basked in his good favour. Whatever poetry teaching I give my students now was got from Fergal Rua, but it cannot match his teaching. Through his death, I realise how I value poetry. O hut of our mystery, empty and isolated always. Anya's son is dead. Poetry is daunted. A stave of the barrel is smashed, and the wall of learning broken. It's what we felt when Cal left. The pride that we have in what Robert and his colleagues are doing here, the maintenance of the art, as he said, is all present in the bardic commitments in that poem, and in the deep affection and the sense of belonging together that's in it. Peter was saying about, joking about being a young poet. One of the great joys of assembling like this with poets of all ages is to realize that when you come together, we're all young poets. There's no such thing as an old poet once there are two or three gathered together. Anyway, I say this even though my 70th birthday is coming up, but that's another matter. In the year 2000, I was teaching a class at Harvard, and I was wanting to talk about surprise, how important that aspect of things is in poetry. To surprise yourself, David was saying, to discover yourself, to come alive to yourself. And I was quoting a poem by Robert Graves about the White Goddess, who surprises you. And Graves' poem ends that the poet proceeds, hoping for the muse, careless of where the next bright bolt might fall. And at the same time, I discovered a poem that David had translated in Horace, book 1, number 34 of Horace's Odes. It's about Horace being shocked to the core of his being. He's pretty casual about his religious observances and about his metaphysical interests, but suddenly something happens. Out of a clear blue sky, thunder strikes. It shakes the little state of man. It shakes the big earth, and he is thrown back into awe, into terror, into shock. And this poem I read to the students, and we talked about it again because of that shock, surprise, the sine qua non of a certain kind of terrific poetry. Then the next year, September 11th, 2001, shock, awe, out of a clear blue sky, and the world is shaken, and we in it are shaken, and things aren't the same. And the Latin speaks about the summa, about the high things being brought down, and about the ignored being brought to notice. And so, remembering David's poem, I disobeyed Horace. I beheaded the original poem, took off the first stanza, and then did something worse, wrote an extra one at the end. So this is one of those cases where you say, after Horace, and after David Ferry, with gratitude. The Atlantic shore is mentioned. Atlas stands out at the end of Africa, on the edge of the Atlantic, as far as this Roman poet is concerned. I put in a fancy Latin word at the end, telluric, telos being the word for the earth. Anything can happen. After Horace Odes 134. Anything can happen. You know how Jupiter will mostly wait for clouds to gather head before he hurls the lightning. Well, just now, he galloped his thunder cart and his horses across a clear blue sky. It shook the earth and the clogged under earth, the river Styx, the winding streams, the Atlantic shore itself. Anything can happen. The tallest towers be overturned, those in high places daunted, those overlooked regarded. Stropped beak fortune swoops, making the air gasp, tearing the crest off one, setting it down bleeding on the next. Ground gives. The heavens' weight lifts up off Atlas like a kettle lid. Capstones shift. Nothing resettles right. Telluric ash and fire spores boil away. The next poem is another translation from Rilke. It's called, in the German, The Site of the Fire, the place where the fire was. I called it After the Fire. It's about a young boy, the morning after there's been a sudden fire in his home, the house. The world has changed, and he is bewildered. And it seemed to me to match the mood of bewilderment after the balefire of September 11th. After the fire, the kid's standing there in the morning. Early autumn morning hesitated, shying at newness, an emptiness behind scorched linden trees, still crowding in around the moorland house, now just one more wallstead, where youngsters gathered up from God knows where, hunted and yelled and ran wild in a pack, yet all of them fell silent when he appeared, the son of the place, and with a long forked stick dragged an out-of-shape old can or kettle from under hot, half-burnt away house beams. And then, like one with a doubtful tale to tell, turned to the others present, at great pains to make them realize what had stood so. For now that it was gone, it all seemed far stranger, more fantastical than Pharaoh. And he was changed, a foreigner among them. The German, or the Swedish crime writer Henning Mankell wrote these great thrillers and kind of grotesque, macabre crimes happening in quiet Sweden. And he just recently published a number of stories about the early life of the detective Kurt Wallander, whom I recommend to you severely. But he said he thought that all these detective stories, he said, were about Swedish anxiety, and in the 90s. And we live in an age of anxiety, and I was delighted to find that I was writing little lyrics which contained a certain amount of decent general anxiety. So I'm going to read two of them. One is called, they just came out of unexpected places, and here are a couple of them. They have that, I hope, winning habit of calling themselves by their first line. Children's hands in close-up, this is called. Children's hands in close-up on a bomb site, picking and displaying small shrapnel curds for cameramen who stalk their levelled village. Ferum and rigor and frigor of mouse-grey iron. The thumb and finger of my own right hand closing around old, cold, hardened plasticine given out by Miss Walls, thumbing it to nests no bigger than an acorn cup, eggs no bigger than a grain of wheat, belly-buttoned sausage men and women laid neatly head to foot and side by side. Seeing the bags of meal. Seeing the bags of meal passed hand to hand in close-up by the aid workers and soldiers firing over the mob, I was braced again with a grip on two sack corners, two packed wads of grain I'd worked to lugs to give me purchase, ready for the heave. The eye-to-eye, 1-2, 1-2, upswing onto the trailer. Then the stoop and drag and drain of the next lift. Nothing surpassed that quick unburdening, backbreak's truest payback, a letting go that will not come again, or it will once and for all. This is called District and Circle, two underground lines in London. I lived for 6 weeks in London in 1960, somewhere of 1962, and I went backwards and forwards from Earl's Court to Petty, France, where I worked in the British Passport Office, not issuing passports, writing the envelopes for those to whom they were issued. And was used to that train journey. There's a number of sonnets simply describing in a documentary fashion what happens when you habitually travel on the London tube train. Always, it's a slightly hallucinatory experience, very strange, very ordinary, very strange. Down, in, along, out. This is a little ghost underground journey, a little ghost book 6 of the Aeneid. The character goes down, he passes someone who lets him pass when he doesn't quite pay his price in, and he eventually meets his ghost father way down there. But it's the strangeness of travelling underground, it's the hauntedness that people had in London after the bombs went up on 7/11. But it's basically an underground train journey with, I hope, a slight uncanniness built in. It's a heap of sonnets, so you have to put up with them. First, you meet a busker, the first one. Tunes from a tin whistle underground, curled up a corridor I'd be walking down, to where I knew I was always going to find my watcher on the tiles, Cap by his side, his fingers perked, his two eyes eyeing me in an unaccusing look I'd not avoid, or not just yet, since both were out to sea for ourselves. As the music larked and capered, I'd trigger and untrigger a hot coin held at the ready. But now my gaze was lowered, for was our traffic not in recognition? Accorded passage, I would repocket and nod, and he, still eyeing me, would also nod. Posted, eyes front, along the dreamy ramparts of escalators ascending and descending to a monotonous slight rocking in the works, we were moved along, upstanding. Elsewhere, underneath, an engine powered, rumbled, quickened, evened, quieted. The white tiles gleamed. In passages that flowed with draughts from cooler tunnels, I missed the light all-overing, long-since mysterious day. Parks at lunchtime, where the sunners lay on body-heated mown grass, regardless. A resurrection scene minutes before the resurrection. Habitués of their garden of delights, of staggered summer. Another level down, the platform thronged. I re-entered the safety of numbers. A crowd half straggle-ravelled and half strung like a human chain, the pushy newcomers jostling and purling underneath the vault, on their mark to be first through the doors, street loud, then succumbing to herd quiet. Had I betrayed or not, myself or him? Always new to me, always familiar, this unrepentant, now repentant turn, as I stood waiting, glad of a first tremor, then caught up in the now or never whelm of one and all, the full length of the train. Stepping onto it, across the gap, onto the carriage metal, I reached to grab the stubby black roof wart and take my stand, from planted ball of heel to heel of hand, as sweet traction and heavy drown slump stayed me. I was on my way, well girded, yet on edge, spot-rooted, buoyed, aloof, listening to the dwindling noises off, my back to the unclosed door, the platform empty, and wished it could have lasted, that long between times pause before the budge and glaze over, when any forwardness was unwelcome, and bodies readjusted, blindsided to themselves and other bodies. So, deeper into it, crowd swept, strap hanging, my lofted arm a swivel like a flail, my father's glazed face in my own waning and craning. Again the growl of shutting doors, the jolt and one-off treble of iron on iron, then a long centrifugal haulage of speed through every dragging socket. And so by night and day to be transported through galleried earth with them, the only relict of all that I belonged to, hurtled forward, reflecting in a window mirror-backed by blasted, weeping rock walls, flicker lit. This is another poem where my father figures rather more substantially. It's called The Harvest Bow, written years ago. A harvest bow is a little decoration woven, plaited out of new wheat straw, made into a little brooch, and worn by people quite unself-consciously. My father made them, wore them, and I asked him to make me one. I was in my 30s, certainly at this stage. And I remembered how beautiful they were. We had grown up with them, paid no attention to them, and then thought, oh, hey. I'm part of something here, you know. So I got it, and I put it on my lapel, and I felt very self-conscious and very swanky, you know, folksy, anthropologically correct. So I took it off. However, it is an Indo-European survival, and we can't be skittish about it. So I wrote the poem, The Harvest Bow. There's a reference to my father's politically incorrect behaviour. He used to attend cockfights and kept a game cock, but never brought me to a cockfight. So that was correct, I suppose. The Harvest Bow. As you plaited the harvest bow, you implicated the mellowed silence in you, in wheat that does not rust. It should be said he rarely spoke out of turn or in turn, even. As you plaited the harvest bow, you implicated the mellowed silence in you, in wheat that does not rust, but brightens as it tightens, twist by twist, into a knowable corona, a throwaway love knot of straw. Hands that aged round ash plants and cane sticks and lapped the spurs in a lifetime of game cocks, harked to their gift and worked with fine intent until your fingers moved somnambulant. I tell and finger it like braille, gleaning the unsaid off the palpable. And if I spy into its golden loops, I see us walk between the railway slopes into an evening of long grass and midges, blue smoke straight up, old beds and ploughs in hedges, an auction notice on an outhouse wall. You with the harvest bow in your lapel, me with the fishing rod, already homesick for the big lift of these evenings, as your stick, whacking the tips off weeds and bushes, beats out of time and beats, but flushes nothing. That original townland, still tongue-tied in the straw tied by your hand. The end of art is peace, could be the motto of this frail device, that I have pinned up on our deal dresser, like a drawn snare, slipped lately by the spirit of the corn, yet burnished by its passage, and still warm. David Ferry is translating the Aeneid. I, for years, promised myself I would translate book 6 of it, because when I was in my Latin class at school, a teacher, the set book for the state exam was Aeneid, book 9. And the teacher said every week at some point, "Ach, boys, I wish it were book 6. So, a magnificent teaching device, you know. So I eventually saw what he meant and was fiddling around with it. But this is book 6 commingled, bits of book 6 commingled with my own riverbank in Moyola. One of my favourite lines in Christopher Marlowe's work is from Dr. Faustus, where Faustus is putting Mephistopheles at his ease and saying, "There's no problem, you know, I can handle this." He said, "For I confound hell in Elysium." So I confound the River Moyola with the River Lethe in this stuff. And then I'm going to read the last 2 sections of a 12-section sequence, which I wrote on the birth of our first grandchild. Book 6 ends up with Anchises giving Aeneas down in the underworld a vision of the future of Rome. All this imperial grandeur and carnage and augury and everything ahead. But my future at the end of my little journey in the sequence is the grandchild arriving from the bank of Lethe, where, of course, the souls who are going to be reincarnated all congregate. First the riverbank field, and then the other 2 little things. So, the riverbank field. Ask me to translate what Loeb gives as, in a retired vale, a sequestered grove, and I'll confound the Lethe in Moyola by coming through Back Park, down from Grove Hill, across Long Riggs, onto the river bank. Which way, by happy chance, will take me past those domos placidas. We said placidas in our school. Placidas, I know, can be said also. Those peaceful homes of Upper Broch. Moths, then, on evening water, it would have to be, not butterflies in sunlight, midge veils instead of lily beds, but stet to all the rest, the willow leaves Elysian silvered, the grass so fully fledged and unimprinted, it can't not conjure thoughts of passing spirit troops, animae, quibus altera fato corpora debentur, spirits, that is, to whom second bodies are owed by fate. And now to continue, as enjoined too often, in my own words. All these presences, once they have done their turn of 1,000 years, are summoned here to drink from Lethe River, so that memories of this limbo life are shed, and souls repine to dwell once more in flesh under the dome of heaven. So this is the last two sections of a sequence called Route 110. Those evenings when we'd just fish and wait and watch. Then that evening the otter's head appeared in the flow. Or was it only a surfaced rock and gleam we took for an otter's head? No doubting, all the same, the gleam, a turnover warp in the black quick water. Or doubting the solid ground of the riverbank field, twilit and a hover with midge drifts, as if we had commingled among shadows stirring on the brink of Lethe, and stood there waiting, watching, needy and ever needier for translation. And now the age of births, as when once at dawn from the foot of our back garden, the last to leave the party came with fresh plucked flowers to quell whatever smells of drink and smoke would linger on where mother and child were due later that morning from the nursing home. So now, for a morning offering to one whose long wait on the shaded bank has ended, I arrive with my bunch of stalks and silvered heads, like tapers that won't burn, like tapers that won't dim, as her earth light breaks and we gather round, talking baby talk. Thank you very much. Hey, how are we doing for time? What time is it? About 10 minutes? Well, sorry. I think I'm going to speed up a bit here. This is called Miracle. I was given a second chance after I was struck down by a stroke a couple of years ago, happily, quickly recovered from. But I began to realize that in the great story in the New Testament about the man who was cured of the palsy, being lowered through the roof and being healed by the Christ, that was great. That was terrific for him. But in a way, the real story, the real beauty, are the guys who carried him. And it's the friendship factor, the sustenance, the help, the human chain aspect of that I learned through my experience should be celebrated. So this is a little short post-traumatic event. Yeah. No, I thought I had it. My God, I know I have it somewhere. I hate people who do this, you know. Actually, I must tell a story about this. Some of you have heard it already. Two great Scottish poets, Norman MacCaig, very dry, very ironical, like a kind of cane fishing rod, springy but dry, and another bardic Island Gaelic speaking a man called Sorley MacLean, who wrote and spoke in Scottish Gaelic. Sorley was an ex-headmaster, and he got to a stage where he's full of habits and strangenesses. And when he'd get up to read, he had to check his watch and get the papers, and nearly lost the papers, and spoke to his wife in the front row, and there was a whole business. And McCaig was in the front row when one of these readings was starting, and he said, "I knew Sorley was going to read," he said, "but I thought he was going to read out loud." So I'm sorry for the hold-up, but miracle. Not the one who takes up his bed and walks, but the ones who have known him all along and carry him in. Their shoulders numb, they ache and stoop, deep locked in their backs. The stretcher handles slippery with sweat. And no let-up until he's strapped on tight, made tiltable, and raised to the tiled roof, then lowered for healing. Be mindful of them as they stand and wait for the burn of the paid-out ropes to cool, their slight lightheadedness and incredulity to pass, those ones who have known him all along. This is 6 reasons for planting an alder tree. It's called Planting the Alder. And it's Planting the Alder. For the bark, dulled argent, roundly wrapped and pigeon-collared. For the splitter-splatter guttering rain-flirt leaves. For the snub and clot of the first green cones, smelted emerald, chlorophyll. For the scut and scat of cones in winter, so rattle-skinned, so fossil-brittle. For the alder wood, flame-red when torn branch from branch. But mostly for the swinging locks of yellow catkins, planted, streel-head in the rain. This is called Tate's Avenue, one of the most unromantic places in Belfast, where romance flourished once. It also could be called 3 mats or 3 rugs or whatever. Anyway, it will become clear gradually. Tate's Avenue. Not the brown and fawn car rug, that first one, spread on sand by the sea, but breathing land breaths, its vestal folds unfolded, its comfort zone edged with a fringe of sepia-coloured wool tails. Not the one scraggy with crusts and eggshells and olive stones and cheese and salami rinds laid out by the torrents of the Guadalquivir, where we got drunk before the corrida. Instead, again, it's Locked Park, Sunday Belfast, a walled backyard, the dust bins high and silent as a page is turned, a finger twirls warm hair, and nothing gives on the rug or the ground beneath it. I lay at my length and felt the lumpy earth, keen-sensed more than ever through discomfort, but never shifted off the plaid square once. When we moved, I had your measure and you had mine. I was saying to David Ferry before we came up here, this is the translator's motto. I had your measure and you had mine. And this is what we hope. So I thought I would read 3 short translations from the Irish and then 1 poem to get out on. The poem I want to end with is called The Blackbird of Glanmore. It refers back to poems of my own, a poem of my own about a young brother who was killed in a road accident. It refers back to a translation I did of Sophocles' play. and it refers back to other blackbird poems, of which here are three from early Irish. Antain bec rolig fed o do ringib glan vidya. Fokerd feid osloch laeg lundoch raiv kern vidya. I translated it twice. The small bird let it chirp from its beak. I heard wood notes, whin gold, sudden, the laggin blackbird. Then I translated it again. The small bird chirped, yellow neb, a note spurt, blackbird over, laggin water, clumps of yellow, whin burst. 2 9th century blackbirdie poems then. Bird song from a willow tree, wet note music, clear, airy, inky treble, yellow bill, blackbird practicing his scale. This is sometimes called the scribe in the woods. These are hermit poems. Pent under a high tree canopy, a blackbird, listen, sings for me. Above the ruled choirs of my book, I hear the wild birds jubilant. From a tree covered, shadow mantled, cuckoo's clear sing-song delights me. Oh, at the last, the Lord protect me. How well I write beneath the wood. They were pretty proud of themselves, those anchorites. How well I write beneath the wood. Yeah. An old Irish scholar I know points out the first person singular operates about 12 times in 8 lines in that poem, somewhere or other. Anyway. The Blackbird of Glanmore, placed down in County Wicklow. This is it. Thank you very much for bringing me here, for listening. And as I say, it is an honour to be part of this continuum of talent, gift. The Blackbird of Glanmore. On the grass when I arrive, filling the stillness with life, but ready to scare off at the very first wrong move. In the ivy when I leave, it's you, blackbird, I love. I park, pause, take heed, breathe, just breathe and sit, and lines I once translated come back. I want away to the house of death, to my father under the low clay roof. And I think of one gone to him, a little stillness dancer, haunter son, lost brother, cavorting through the yard, so glad to see me home, my homesick first term over. And think of a neighbour's words long after the accident. Yon bird on the shed roof, up the ridge for weeks. I said nothing at the time, but I never liked yon bird. She read the world by omen. The automatic lock clunks shut. The blackbird's panic is short-lived. For a second, I've a bird's eye view of myself, a shadow on raked gravel in front of my house of life. Hedge hop, I am absolute for you, your ready talk back, your each standoffish comeback, your picky, nervy goldbeak, on the grass when I arrive, in the ivy when I leave. Thank you very much.